In Chapter 10, we're going to start talking about performance indicators. This is something that's really important for musicians and anybody who wants to understand how to read music better. If you understand what all the different symbols in music mean, then you're going to be able to interpret the music a little bit better, and you'll have a better understanding of what the composer or arranger was going for with a particular piece. We're going to start by talking about the role of performance indicators, and then we'll get into the ties, slurs, phrasing, and bowing marks that look the same but mean different things depending on the context. We're also going to talk about a concept known as a break in music. We'll talk more about bar lines. You're going to find that there's actually many different types of bar lines, and depending on how they're used, they can mean different things. We're also going to talk about repeat symbols, which indicate that a performer should play a certain section over again. Volta brackets go along with repeat symbols. They're an indicator that lets you know what ending to play on which repeat, which you'll understand by the end of this chapter. We're also going to talk about octave displacement and dynamic marking. So dynamic markings basically tell you how loud or soft to play a piece. So performance indicators provide guidelines for helping musicians to recreate a musical work in a similar fashion. So what that means is if you have two musicians on opposite sides of the country or the world even, you can give them the same piece and they'll have a general understanding of what the composer intended in terms of how fast to play it, how loud to play it, when to slow certain sections down, when to accent certain notes, when to play some notes shorter. Performance indicators are just a way for the composer to try and get their intentions out on the paper, even if they can't be there in the room to direct the performance. So some of the things that they might do, these performance indicators, is to tell the performer how fast or slow to perform a piece. They also might provide a clue to the interpretation of the composer, and that can be a difficult thing when the composer isn't in the room. So these performance indicators just make it possible to get a better understanding of how the composer would perform the work if they were in the room with you or performing all the parts. Indicators also help to determine how a musical performance should be shaped. So this goes right down to how every single note in the piece should be performed and articulated. Ties, slurs, phrasing, and bowing marks. They all kind of look the same. It's this line that connects one note to another note, and it's just a round curved line, but depending on how it's used, they mean different things. So if you see the first line there, where you've got these notes that are tied to each other, we call these ties because they are simply extending the length of the note. In the first note, you've got a beat that's 2 beats long. That B4 there is 2 beats long. It's then connected to another B4 that is half that value. It's 1 beat long. So that tie, what it does is makes those two notes combine, so you have a note that's actually worth 3 beats. So you'd hold that note for an entire 3 beats. They're most useful for tying a note from one measure to the next, like you see between measure 1 and measure 2, that E5. That E5 is actually going to be held for 2 beats, but since there's a bar line, you can't fit another beat in that first measure, so what the composer did is they just tied that note over to the next measure. So ties are basically just a way of extending note values while still indicating where the beat falls in the piece. The next example is an example of a slur. Now slurs are usually pretty short. What they mean is you should play the two notes together really connected. So rather than having any separation between the note, when you see a slur between 2 or more notes, it can occur between 3 or 4 notes even, or even 10 notes. But when you see a slur, it means that you need to connect the notes. So slurs are normally not used for an entire phrase, and a phrase is basically a melody. They're generally used for smaller sections within a phrase or a melody. If you look at the third line, what you have there are phrasing marks, and you see how that line extends from the first note all the way to the last note. So that is how you know that the composer is trying to indicate the phrasing. The composer is trying to say this melody starts on the first beat and ends at the end of that whole note in measure 3. So phrase markings can be useful when the melody isn't always that clear and the composer feels like they need to indicate where the melody begins and ends. The final one is something that you're not going to see much in this course, but bowing marks. With a bowing mark, you have what looks like a slur, but also above the first note, generally, the first note of the slur, you'll see one of these symbols, either an upside down box, it kind of looks like a table, or a V shape. And the V shape indicates an up bow, which means it's going to have a very light attack, and the box shape is going to indicate a down bow, which means it has a hard attack. Not a heart attack, but a hard attack with a D on the end. So these are just ways to indicate how a string player should articulate the phrase using their bow. And that's a little more advanced of a concept, so you don't actually have to know that, but you should be aware that this kind of marking also does exist. They're called bowing marks. So now, just to make sure you understand this, ties, slurs, phrasing, and bowing marks all serve useful functions in music. In general, ties occur between identical notes. They will actually always occur between identical notes. They're used to extend the value of a note. In the first measure, the first two notes would be held without a break. So they'd be held for a total of 3 beats. You don't necessarily know your note values yet, but once you understand your note values, then you'll understand how it's held for 3 beats. Ties are also useful for extending a note across the bar line. So that's what you should know about the tie. Those are the 3 main points there. A slur. A slur is intended to connect 2 different notes in a manner that eliminates all separation between the notes. So it's played smoothly. You play the notes under the slur without any break at all. If you're playing on a brass instrument, that means you're not going to use your tongue to re-articulate the next note. If you're playing it on the piano, you might use one of the pedals to create a smoother transition between the notes, or you'll be very careful to release your fingers on each note at the exact moment to make it appear more legato and more connected. So the goal is to make a passage sound smooth and connected. The musical term for this is legato, but a slur can also be used to indicate to the performer that there should be no breath between a set of notes. So again, that's just saying that with certain wind players, anybody who has to use the breath to play their instrument, an instrument that requires air, they can use, the composer might use slurs to indicate when they should breathe and how they should articulate the actual notes within a phrase. So phrase marks look like slurs, but they're typically used to indicate the shape and contour of a melody. When a slur stretches over numerous notes, it may indicate that the composer is trying to indicate the phrasing. Phrase marks do cause some confusion, but a good rule of thumb is that if a passage can't be played in a single breath, then it's likely a phrase mark. Also, if it appears that the melody begins and ends in a complete way, and the phrase mark goes over the entire melody, then you're probably looking at a phrase mark, although the composer also may want you to play it very connected and legato, but you'll have to figure that one out based on other clues in the score and the context that you find this. So for bowing, composers may indicate the direction a string player should move their bow by using a symbol that looks like a slur. Usually, the first note is indicated with a special symbol that tells the string player to connect the string from the frog. That's the bottom portion of the bow to the tip. That's the top portion of the bow. When a player starts a note near the frog of the bow, it's known as a down bow. That's your stronger attack. When the attack begins with the tip of the bow, it's known as an up bow. That's going to be a weaker, more subtle entrance. Unless indicated otherwise by using a rectangular shape for the down bow or a V shape for the up bow, the string player will alternate the direction at the end of each bowing mark. So for any of you who want to get into writing for strings, that's a pretty important concept to understand. But you also, if you're going to go that route, you also have to learn how the instruments actually work so that you can write music that is playable on that instrument. and that's a whole nother course. Okay, now we're going to talk about breaks and the caesura. So ties, slurs, phrasing, and bowing marks all serve useful functions in music. Breath marks are placed between notes to provide a short separation between segments of music. So the breath mark is when the composer has a very specific place where they want a separation or they want the performer to breathe. And it just looks like an apostrophe there between the two notes. You see that in the first image. The caesura, also known as railroad tracks, the caesura is indicated that the performer should pause until the lead performer or conductor indicates it's time to resume playing. So if you happen to see this in your music, you stop. If you've got a conductor, you wait for them to continue conducting again and bring you back in as an ensemble. If this is a solo piece, then you have to make a decision on how long you need to wait before moving on to the next part. It basically just means you're going to stop for a moment in the music. So we have many different types of bar lines. Depending on the bar line that is used, it can change various aspects of the music and how it's performed. So take a look at this and notice how each set of bar lines differ. In the first image, you see the single bar line. You've already seen that before. In the second image, we have double bar lines. In the third image, we have a dashed bar line or a broken bar line. And in the final image, everything looks the same until that final bar line. Everything has single bar lines until that final bar line. And that's actually called a final bar line. It means the piece is over. So now let's talk about these individually. So the single bar line, they are used to separate measures. They may also be used to connect more than one staff in a piece of music. So that would be called a systemic bar line when it extends through more than one staff. The single bar line is the most common type of bar line used in a musical work. You're going to see this more often than any of the other types of bar lines. The double bar line are used to separate sections of music. They're also used before a new key signature or time signature is placed in the music. Double bar lines serve as an alert to an important change in the music. So if you see a double bar line, you know the composer has done something different and you need to pay attention because it's important, whatever they did. They really want you to pay attention to it. Often it means that a new section is coming up. Maybe the mood of the piece has changed. Maybe the key has changed. Less often they'll use it when a time signature changes, unless that time signature change indicates a new section. So the double bar line just indicates something important has changed in the music. The dash bar line. This may be used in more complex meters, so that's instead of your standard 4/4 time signature, maybe you have one time signature that's like 7/4, where you've got 7 beats in a single measure, and they want to show the division between 4 and 3 beats, so they want to indicate the first 4 notes in the measure should be played as a 4/4 bar, then maybe the second 3 notes or the last 3 notes should be played as a 3/4 bar. The dashed bar line is generally just used to indicate a division within a longer time signature. So a measure that has 5 beats may be divided with a dashed bar line into a set of 2 beats and then 3 beats. And if the composer wants to alternate the accent, if at first they want the accent to be on the first beat and the third beat, and then they want it to be on the first beat and then the fourth beat, or the first beat and the second beat, they can use the dashed bar line to indicate the accent structure of that particular time signature is changed. So it's a way to keep the time signature the same without having to actually employ a lot of different time signatures to indicate a more off-balance rhythm. And it can also be used to divide extremely long measures to make them easier to interpret. So sometimes you may have a piece that has 17 beats in a single measure. Well, the dashed bar line can help divide that measure up into more understandable and easily playable divisions of time. Finally, we have the final bar line. You're going to see this a lot too. It comes at the end of a piece of music. There shouldn't be additional measures after the final bar line. It consists of one normal width line and one extra wide line. So the final bar line simply signifies the end of a piece or movement. Alright, so now we're going to talk about repeat symbols. Repeat symbols are used to indicate how a musician should perform repetitive sections of music. A piece may repeat a single bar, phrase, or entire section of music. So you've got your SEGNO sign. That's your first symbol. And it basically just translates to the word sign. Then you have your CODA sign. It looks like a target. And then the repeat sign. The repeat sign actually consists of two parts. There's a forward and a backward repeat. If the forward repeat isn't there, it just means you go back to the beginning of the piece. So the SEGNO sign is used to indicate where a performer should jump when repeating a section. I'll show you an example of this. The CODA indicates the final section of a work. It's the CODA. It's attached to the end of a complete work. And the repeat sign is used to indicate the beginning of a repeated section when you have a forward repeat, and then you'll see the backward repeat later on to indicate the end of that section. The CAPO, it's abbreviated as DC, it means the head, and it indicates the performer should return to the beginning of the piece, or the top of the piece, the first measure. When used in conjunction with the al fine instruction, it indicates that the performer should return to the beginning of the work and play until the fine text indicator. When used in conjunction with the al coda sign, it indicates that the performer should return to the beginning of the piece and then jump to where the first coda indication is provided to the second coda sign to finish off the piece. So if you see DC al coda, what you'll do is you'll go back to the very beginning of the piece, and once you hit the first coda sign, and then you'll play all the way through until you hit the coda sign again, and then you'll jump to the final coda sign to finish off the piece. So here's da capo, the head, abbreviated as DC. So what you see here is you got your first 7 measures, and then you have that DC al fine, and notice there's a double bar line to indicate that something's changing. So what you do is you play the entire first 7 bars, and then you jump back to the beginning of the piece, play the first 7 bars again, and then keep going until you see the fine sign, and then you'd stop. So here's just an explanation of that further. So when the DC al fine is used, the performer should return to measure 1 once the double bar line has been reached, and then play through the rest of the work until the end of the composition. So that's a fairly simple use of this, and it just prevents the composer from having to rewrite that entire section again. DC al coda is a little more complicated, but when you see this sign, the performer should return to measure 1 at the double bar line, where you see the DC al coda signal. You might not always have a double bar line, but usually there will be one. And then the performer should play the first 7 measures, return to measure 1, then jump to measure 8 when the 2 coda instruction is displayed. So you see that in measure 3. So at the end of measure 3, they would jump to measure 8 where you see the coda sign. Instead of writing 2 coda, you see the second example, they just use the coda sign in both instances. So that would indicate, it's just a simpler way of showing where you jump. So if you see that DC al coda at the end of the 7th bar, you go back to bar 1, you play the first 3 bars, and you'll either see the text that says 2 coda, or you'll see a coda sign. And that coda sign indicates where you should jump to the end of the piece. Dal segno, the sign, indicates that the performer should return to that dal segno sign in the piece. This symbol may appear as DS al fine or DS al coda, and that will change whether or not you're going back to the sign then playing till the end of the piece. That would be fine. Or if you're going to go back to the sign and then play until you see the coda sign, in which case you'll jump to the coda. So in the example below, you should play the first 7 measures, return to measure 3, and then you'd continue playing until the end of the piece. When you see DC al coda, the performer should return to the sign and then jump at the coda indicator. So here you see in measure 7, the DCL CODA indicator, you jump all the way back to measure 2, and then at the end of measure 3, where you see the 2 CODA sign, you'll play all of measure 3, and then you'll jump to the CODA sign in measure 8 and finish off the piece. Again, as with the other example, you can also just use the CODA symbol instead of writing 2 CODA in the actual instructions. Okay, our next thing, we've also got something called Volta brackets. These provide alternate endings that a performer should play the first and second time that they take a repeat. It's also possible to have more than 2 endings. These brackets are used in conjunction with repeat signs. So you might see ending 1, ending 2, ending 3, ending 4, and you'd keep playing until you've played through all the endings, and then on the final ending, let's say it's ending 4, you'd continue and play to the end of the piece. So here's an example of that. So in this example, you see the forward and the backward repeat sign, and you see the first ending. That's the first ending starts in measure 4. So you'd play the first 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 bars. You hit that repeat sign, you go back to the beginning of the forward repeat. You play the first, second, and third bar. And then instead of that first ending, you jump to the second ending. So then you continue playing until something else in the score tells you need to make a change. But for the most part, that's how this works. And if you had 4 endings or more, then you'd have to play each one of those endings before you could go on and finish the piece. So the example could be written without Volta brackets, and it would look like this below. You'll see that the Volta brackets are just a simpler way of writing this out, so you don't have to repeat the same notes. So typically, notes written in the staff will have a lower pitch than notes written above the staff. However, ottava and quindicesima symbols can be used to change the highness or the lowness of a written pitch. So there are 4 types of ottava and quindicesima symbols. The ottava symbols change the pitch by 1 octave, just 1 octave. And ottava alta means that you raise the pitch 1 octave. So if you see a C4 written on the score and ottava alta written above it, it means you're actually going to play an octave higher, so it'll sound like C5. Ottava bassa lowers the pitch by 1 octave, so if you see a C4, you'd actually play a C3 if the ottava bassa symbol was there. Quindicesima symbol change the pitch by 2 octaves. So in quindicesima alta, you raise the pitch by 2 octaves, so C4 becomes C6. In quindicesima bassa, you lower the pitch by 2 octaves, so C4 becomes C2. So here's an example of all of these. So the 8VA symbol raises the pitch by 1 octave. It's also known as ottava alta. Note that the symbol is placed above the staff. The 8VB symbol lowers the pitch by 1 octave. Note that this symbol is placed below the staff. One thing that can get confusing is that the 8VA symbol may also be used to lower the pitch an octave if it's placed below the staff. In general, you just shouldn't place the 8VA symbol below the staff because it's going to cause confusion. Most people will assume that 8VA means you play it an octave above. And even if you move it below the staff system, which is technically okay, and it would mean that you do the opposite, you actually have to play it an octave lower, it's still going to require the musician to look at the piece and make sure this wasn't just an error, because it's a little bit weird to put the 8VA symbol below the staff, but it does happen, especially if there's no room to put it above the staff because of maybe you're in a piano part and there's just no room to fit it in. But in general, while putting it below the staff is okay and technically correct, it's something that's generally avoided. So 15MA is what the quindicesima symbol looks like. It raises the pitch by 2 octaves. It's also known as quindicesima alta. Note that the symbol is placed above the staff. And 15MB, or quindicesima bassa, lowers the pitch by 2 octaves. Note that this symbol is placed below the staff system. So these are just ways of keeping notes within the staff system without having to, well, if you wrote them out of the staff system, you'd have to use several ledger lines. So this is a way of avoiding the use of several ledger lines and just making it a little more clear for the performer to read. So you'll notice here with the 8VA, the first two measures will sound the same as the next two measures because all the notes under that 8VA sign are going to be played an octave higher. Same with the 8VB. First two measures sounds the exact same as the second two measures, and same with the 8VA when you put it below the staff. First two measures will sound the same as the last two measures. Here again, 15MA, the first two measures sounds the same as the last two measures. In 15MB, the first two measures sounds the same as the last two measures. There's also another way that you can change the pitch. When an 8 or a 15 is placed below a clef, it indicates that the written pitches should be lowered by 1 or 2 octaves respectively. So if you see an 8, you lower it by 1 octave. If you see a 15, you lower it by 2. You can also place this number above the staff, and that would indicate the opposite. So you play an octave higher or 2 octaves higher, depending on whether you have an 8 or a 15. So 8 indicates an octave, and 15 indicates 2 octaves. It's not 16, because if you remember, you've got your first, if you count all the pitches from C4 up to C6, you'll find there's actually 15 pitches, not 16. If the number is placed above the staff, it means it's necessary to play the pitches 1 octave or 2 octaves higher. Okay, so the final thing we got to talk about are dynamic markings. So dynamic markings indicate the volume of a section. MP in the middle means mezzo piano, and that's going to be about a medium soft level. Mezzo forte would be medium loud. So somewhere around mezzo piano and mezzo forte might be your normal speaking voice. And then it gets quieter the more P's you add, and it gets louder the more F's you add. So dynamic markings are used to indicate the volume of a section. A dynamic is placed directly underneath the note to indicate the current volume of the piece. While dynamics control the overall dynamic level of a piece, they are also useful for helping to identify the beginning of a melody, various climaxes, and different sections within a musical work. So you can actually use a dynamic marking to indicate that there's a new section. And you might see that employed with the double bar line as well, if that's the case. Composers can also use dynamics to give structure to a composition by changing the dynamic level when a new section is introduced or by building to the climax of a previous section. A new dynamic level can make a stark difference when it comes to repeating sections. You can change a dynamic from very loud to soft, and the piece can take on an entirely different mood and character. So you could play the same piece extremely soft or extremely loud, and it's going to change the intent and mood of the work. So here's just an overview of the dynamic marking volumes. You've got quadruple piano, also known as pianissimo. It's barely audible. Then you've got triple piano. You've got a double piano, mezzo forte. Forte is loud. Fortissimo is very loud, fortissimo is extremely loud, and fortissimo is generally as loud as possible. So these can actually get pretty complicated if you're using the Italian to try and refer to dynamic levels. Most musicians will just say quadruple piano, triple piano, double piano, piano, mezzo forte, forte, double forte, triple forte, or quadruple forte. It's generally a little bit easier to understand, and you don't have all those S's involved. So that's it for chapter 10. Read your textbook to learn more about this stuff, and I'll see you in chapter 11.